Well, hey, we're going to talk small groups today, and in particular, we want to deal with this idea of health. How to have a healthy small group. So, Mike, why don't you just kick us off? What are some thoughts and on health that you see? And we'll go to dysfunctions here in a moment. Unhealthiness, but what are some signs of good health in a small group? And at any point where you have a question or something, feel free just to open your mic up and ask. That's the way we'll run it.
Yeah, that's great. And I could, like I was telling you before, Rick, I could riff on this thing for hours, but I'll cut it way down. I've actually written a couple books on this particular topic. One is called Small Group Vital Signs, and there's a little story behind that. I'll get to that in a second. And then the other one is called The Pocket Guide to Burnout-Free Small Group Leadership. It's a mouthful. The Pocket Guide to Burnout-Free Small Group Leadership. They both deal with health of small groups in different ways. So small group vital signs, a story behind that is that I was leading a small group ministry here in Louisville, Kentucky, and had been leading it for quite a few years. It was doing well. It was prospering. We had, at that time, probably about 100 small groups. And the senior minister one day I think it seemed offhandedly to me, but I think he had been thinking about it for a while. And he asked me this question. He said, Mike, are our small groups healthy? And I said, as a good small group leader, I said, yeah, sure, they're healthy. And I could tell him stories of healthy groups. But then he said, I want you to prove it. I want you to give me like data. I don't just want stories. I want you to show me that our groups are healthy. So I was thinking, how do you do that? How do you take some dynamic, organic kind of thing and prove that? So I came up with a survey that I sent out to all of our small group leaders. First thing I had to do was figure out what are the signs of health. What does it even mean for a group to be healthy in the first place? So we came up with these 7, what we ended up calling vital signs. And I came up with various questions for each of those. And I surveyed all of our small group leaders to find out if our groups were healthy in general, which groups were and were not healthy. And by the way, that survey, if you're interested in it for any reason, that survey is on the publisher's website. It's at touchusa.org, touchusa.org. It was published, the book was published by Touch Outreach Ministries in Houston. And if you drop down on their website, let me just look at it here real quick to remember where it is. There's a drop down. A lot of people were interested in this. There's a drop down called free resources, and then drop down to small group health assessment for group leaders and their members. So leaders and members of the group can take this assessment. So we got that information back, and then we had to, go through it and figure out what it all meant. And we followed that up with a number of some workshops for our leaders on different topics to help those groups become more healthy. I developed coaching in order to help groups get healthier in some of those areas where they were weaker. We found out that our men's groups were really strong in some areas and not as strong in others. Our women's groups were strong in different areas and not as strong in others. And so that helped us kind of hone in and figure out where we could grow in the health of our groups. One of the things I always say about health groups is that healthy things in general, this isn't a complete statement, but in general, healthy things grow, they bear fruit, and they multiply. If it's healthy, those things will happen. I had spent years trying to get my small groups to reproduce in our church with very, very little success. And I came up with all kinds of ways to get them to reproduce. As soon as we started really focusing on health of the small groups, we started seeing small group reproduction without even hardly trying. It just happened because the groups were healthy. So I really hone in on this idea now of trying to get your groups to be healthy and then the rest will come. So what I want to do, Rick, if it's okay, is just kind of go through and talk about the 7 vital signs that we came up with. Is that all right?
Yes.
All right. So vital sign number 1, and I'm just reading from the table of contents from my own book. So vital sign number 1 is a healthy group is a Christ-centered community. I'm just going to run through them all really quick, and then I'll go through and just make a comment or two about each one. Number 2 is a healthy group has a healthy, overflowing leader. Number 3 is a healthy group shares leadership with a core team. Number 4 is a healthy group has proactive leadership. I'll come back and tell you what that means in a moment. Number 5 is a healthy group lives in authentic community. That's sort of a, well, duh. Number 6 is a healthy group ministers to others. And then vital sign number 7 is a healthy group is a discipling environment. Okay, so the first one, I started with the most important one, the one that you have to get right first, because if you don't get it right, you won't get the rest of them right. And that is a healthy group is a Christ-centered community. So the group's all about Christ and his mission. That's got to come first. And it's just so important. The problem with that one is that some of our groups assumed that they were Christ-centered until we started really digging into what that really means for a group to be Christ-centered. And I don't have time now to flesh all of that out, but it's a lot more than just ending your meeting in prayer, right? It's a lot more than just making sure you do a Bible study at every meeting. It has to do with what the group's all about. So I'd love to spend more time on that, but let me go to the second one. A healthy group has a healthy, overflowing leader. So for the group to be healthy, the leader needs to be healthy. Wow. And what that really means is, I say overflowing there, and that's a key word for me. And one of the things I always say is leadership is overflow. If we're going to define what leadership really is, Christian spiritual leadership, I say it's overflow. And you've probably heard that leadership is influence, right? Who wrote the book, Leadership is Influence? John Maxwell wrote the book, Leadership is Influence. The way I think about that is leadership is influence. That's true, but only to the extent that God is influencing people through me. I'll repeat that because I think it's such a critical thing to think about. Leadership is influence only to the extent that God is influencing people through me. So one of my favorite quotes, maybe my favorite quote, is a Mother Teresa quote where she says, "I'm a little pencil in the hand of a writing God who's sending a love letter to the world." Have you heard that before? It's just such a good quote. It's something that I want to be all about my life. I want my life to reflect, and I think every great leader, every small group leader should try to lead like Jesus did, where I'm only going to do what the Father shows me to do. I'm only going to speak what the Father gives me to speak. And that has to come from that humility. It has to come from looking to the Father first and then just overflowing. I've got to spend time with God every day so that then I can just overflow what he's pouring into me, into the lives of people around me. If we miss that, again, the rest of these vital signs are going to be really hard to make happen. And so I want my group leaders, when I'm pouring into my group leaders, I've always wanted to make sure that their relationship with Christ comes first. I can teach them all kinds of how to lead kind of things, but their relationship with Christ has to come first. Third one is that a healthy group shares leadership with a core team. I was interested, as Rick, when you were talking to Joe last week, And Joe's one of my heroes, by the way. I love Joe Myers.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Before we move on to the next point, the idea of
Absolutely.
overflow, I love it. I think it's great for people to be ministering out of overflow. Um, is there a recommendation you have, like if a small group leader is just going through a difficult season of life, should they not be a small group leader if they're, I guess there's just been some seasons in ministry where there wasn't any overflow. I just had to show up and trust God that something good would happen because I showed up.
Yeah.
But there wasn't an overflow to speak of. And I'm just curious how you would coach a small group leader. Do you coach them to step down during that season, or do you coach them to press through?
It depends on the situation. There have been times where I've talked to a leader, and so first of all, when I have that conversation, I want us to be able to come to a consensus, the two of us, that we both agree that maybe it's better if that they step down for a while, but stay in the group and just let somebody else lead for a while, which, by the way, is a really good thing. Sometimes that has great results by just doing that. But I would coach them, or have somebody else in my ministry coach them and kind of walk with them for a little while. It depends on what that circumstance is that you're talking about. It all depends on what that has to do with. So if they just feel like they're not overflowing, we're not looking for perfect leaders. We're looking for people who sometimes will just show up and just do the best with what God's doing with them. And I don't expect my leaders to be like 10 steps above everybody else in the group. I just want them to be at least a step above in front of everybody else. And sometimes they're struggling. And if they can go to the group and admit they're struggling, that can have great ramifications for the group.
Actually, Joe talked last week at the end about an idea he called of decentralizing small groups.
Yeah.
Caused a little bit of a rip in the force in how we often do small groups, but he used a concept called grab, gather, and grow. And similarly, obviously, and he talked about like a 9-year-old kid could do this. And I'm thinking, well, in some ways, there's some sense of that, because if a 9-year-old kid has the influence, to quote John Maxwell and you, to gather other people to follow him, he's the one that's the step ahead, right? So obviously, that influence is so key. If you cannot influence somebody to follow you, then you probably have a hard time leading a small group.
I agree with that. And that sends me in about 3 different directions at the same time. And I'll allow that to kind of lead me into that next vital sign, which is that a really good small group leader, a wise small group leader, shares leadership. And does so naturally. I always suggested to my leaders to share with a core team. So I said, Jesus had a core team of Peter, James, and John. So have a core team of people who you'll share leadership. And when I say share leadership, I don't necessarily mean just lead the meeting, because a small group, a healthy discipling group, is more than just a meeting. A healthy group is it happens 24/7, right? So when I say share leadership, it's really sharing the discipleship load. I want them to be building into other people's lives. Let me go back to that decentralization, Rick, because that jumped out at me from your discussion last week. I saw some of that. And so that's part of what I'm talking about here. And you guys talked about the Starfish and the Spider book. And I'll second that. Read that book. It's awesome. It's not a Christian book, but it has a lot of influence on the way that we think about leadership. And one of the I don't know if you guys have heard much or have studied much about the discipling movement that's going on all around the world, but that movement is a very decentralized movement. And the idea is to keep things simple and gather a few people around you and lead them in a study of the Bible that is very reproducible. So you ask the same questions every week. Like you don't come you don't need to use some, book that some small group writer like me has written. I don't know. I think Rick's written a few of them too, haven't you? Some small group curriculum.
Yeah.
So and I've written like 20, 25 of those. And these days, I would tell people not to use those, but just to there's a series of questions that you can ask. And if you look up, if you guys talked about this, Rick, at all in your class, but the discipling movement.
No, go ahead. This is great.
Okay. So, and I can't go through what the questions are right now. By the way, in Christian Standard, we're replicating something like these questions right now in our new section. That's the Lookout section. But anyway, they're just very simple questions and you ask basically the same ones every week. And in that way, what happens is people in the group go, I could do that. That's not so hard. And after they've done it a number of times, you've gone through a group and you're answering the same questions, but they're about different Bible verses. So they're all going to be answered differently. After you've done that for a while, you get used to the pattern of it, and people can replicate that and start their own groups. Yeah. And if you subgroup, and I know Rick's patterning that there in your class, which is awesome, but if you subgroup and use that as well, this easily reproducible type of a study method, groups will reproduce quite easily. Yeah. So share leadership, keep it simple, and just make it real reproducible. That's a big key to all of that, I think.
Can I ask you, would you often say that these are great qualities, but really that's the DNA of a group to when it begins. You've got to have these planted, I would suggest, right at the very beginning. Because Christ-centered, we all want to be Christ-centered, but the truth is a lot of our small groups are man-centered. They're centered around a leader, and people, especially if you got a leader who's, charismatic or a great Bible teacher, a lot of people will flock and to that type of a group. But the minute he's gone, the group falls apart because it's center. Yeah.
So when I would do leadership training, upfront leadership training, I would teach all 70 these vital signs and impress on them, and for them to actually say, to themselves and to the group, I'm kind of the designated leader, but I want to let you all know that I'm not the real leader of this group. Jesus is. And I'm leading as sort of, I'm shepherding this group as an under shepherd of Jesus. But we're going to really look to him to lead us, and he's going to lead me as I attempt to lead you guys. And by the way, I'm going to share some leadership with other people as well, because I'm not going to do this all myself. We're all going to kind of play a part in this. The other thing I do that's not a part of the other stuff I'm talking about right now so much, except it's kind of part of community, is I make sure every group member has a role, R-O-L-E, has a role in the group. And I actually pass around a piece of paper that's got a whole variety of small group roles in it. And some of them are like real simple things, like I'm in charge of the coffee, or something like that. But I want to make sure everybody's got a role in the group so that they feel like they're needed to be there every single week. And that makes a huge difference in the group process as well. So you want me to pick up with the next one? Yeah. I've only gotten through number 3 so far. So the next one, vital sign number 4, is a healthy group has a proactive leadership. And all this one is about is that really healthy groups know where they're going. They've got a mission. They've got some sort of a plan in place, not human-made plans, but God-centered plans. And they know where they're going, and then they go after that. There's a mission involved. Not too long ago, I was asked by a couple in church, actually 2 couples in our church, and we're really good friends with these 2 couples. In fact, we've been in small groups with them before, and they asked me to be a part of their small group. And I actually said no, because when I asked them, what's this group about? What's the purpose of this group? They had no idea. They just said, well, it's just to get together. I'm like, okay, so why are you wanting to get together? And they couldn't answer any questions. So I kind of pushed back with them a little bit. Now, I'm not the small group minister at the church anymore, so I couldn't tell them what to do. But I said, I really want to be in a group that has a mission. When you figure that out, let me know. And, I'd like to jump in with you. I just think that's important for a healthy group. You got to know where you're going. So that's the proactive part. The next one is a healthy group lives an authentic Christian community. And that's sort of the duh one. But what I found is when I work with small groups and small group leaders, and I go through a little process with them where I go through the one another's, you say, hey, are you guys living in authentic community? And everybody goes, yeah, sure we are, because we meet every week or every other week. But when I start asking them about the one another's, so yes or no, or on a scale from 1 to 5, how much are you bearing one another's burdens? Well, hardly anybody says we're a 5. How much are you confessing your sins to one another and praying for one another so that you may be healed? When you start looking at each one of those and figuring out, are we really living an authentic community like the New Testament church did? Most groups would admit that they're not doing as well as they should be doing. So that's community. The next one is that a healthy group basically has an outward function as well. They're not just inward focused, they're outward focused. And they serve together. They're sharing the gospel with other people. And they might be doing that individually or as a group or as both. But it's really important for a healthy small group to have that healthy outflow as well as inflow. Again, I could talk a lot more about that one, but I think you understand. And then the last one is that a healthy group lives in a healthy what am I trying to say? In a healthy discipling environment. So I actually put this one last. It's vitally important, but I put it last because I think all the other ones sort of lead up to this one. What's a discipling environment look like? Well, the first 6 kind of lead you to this. And again, I could talk a lot about what a discipling environment, and if you got questions about that, I'd love to ask them. But you've got to be intentional about discipleship in a healthy small group.
Well, actually, thank you very much. That's a great outline. In fact, I don't know about you guys, but this has been golden for me as I think about my own life groups and evaluating some of the issues and stuff that we have going on. And so I got to, as long as we're here, let's go to the other side of it. What are some signs of unhealthiness? What do you think about that, Mike? And then let's open it up for everybody to dive in here and have a conversation.
Right. So when we originally did that that initial survey of all of our groups, we found out where groups were unhealthy, and of course they fall along a lot of these same lines. The most serious of them are the first 2, or even first 3. Those are the ones that I wanted to make sure that we got those figured out first, and they were the ones that took the most intense work. If you got a leader who really, they're just leading out of their flesh, right? They've got some skills, they've got some abilities. They're, like you said, Rick, they naturally sort of draw people to themselves because of their personality and so forth, but they're not living that Christ-like life. They're not spending time with the Lord on a regular basis. That's something I wanted to make sure of and work on. So that's definitely an unhealthy thing. A lot of the things that we learned, though, were things that dealt with community issues, that the groups were selfish. People in the groups were selfish rather than being open to loving others. I mean, if you think about it, one of the first sort of, I don't know if you would call it a small group, but one of the first dysfunctions in the early church went back to selfishness.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there was one couple who really, they were lying too, of course, but they didn't want to share with everybody else like the rest of them were sharing. So they lied about it. And that's a huge dysfunction. And those kinds of things in groups can cause all kinds of problems. I don't know if that answers the question, Rick. I mean,
I think it's a good answer. And from my perspective, it seems like the opposite of all of these are where our dysfunctions are.
they are.
You know, it's a non-discipling environment. All we're concerned about is getting together and having a good time. And
Yeah. Everybody will come into a group with their own preferences,
right.
you know, and perhaps they need to find a group that matches their preferences, or maybe they need to be able to surrender their own preferences for the good of the group and what the Bible is clearly showing us to do.
Yeah.
I tell you a couple things that are interesting with this, Rick, and it's something we found out. I wouldn't have known this before we did the survey work, is that there were two of these vital signs that had the most, what am I trying to say here? The biggest impact on all the rest of them. And they were the two that sort of in the middle, actually. They were the ones that have to do with a core team and proactive leadership. And we found that groups that were unhealthy with those two were unhealthy overall. And the groups that were healthy with those two were the most healthy overall. So, and here's one that you would not usually consider this a dysfunction of a group, but one of the biggest dysfunctions were leaders who led alone. Biggest. I mean, if groups where the leaders led alone and didn't share leadership with others were overall the most unhealthy groups. The groups that where the leaders shared leadership were the healthiest. And one of the things I found out was some of the leaders who were very hesitant leaders when they were first asked to lead were the best leaders, and they had the healthiest groups overall. In fact, one leader, her name is Laura, it took me months of asking her to lead a group because I saw something in her that I believe was going to be, you know, that she had what it takes. So the spiritual things to lead a group. And she kept saying, no, I can't do it. I want to be a good leader. Her group multiplied like 6-7 times. She became one of my coaches, and she even multiplied her coaching role. Mm-hmm. So one of the healthiest leaders I've ever had, who didn't really want to be, she didn't think that she had what it takes to be a great leader.
Well, sure. You were talking about Laura, I think the example of the leader that you had. What did you do to help develop her and get her to a place where she was the leader that she was?
So we started every time we brought in new leaders, and you know, we brought in new leaders in a whole variety of different ways. Some came to us, some I asked, some we kind of recruited overall, you know, big, like when we tried to do a big campaign or something, we might bring in 20-30 leaders at one time. So, but whenever, we always started with training. And I did training in classes of, you know, 20 or 25 people down to one-on-one. Didn't matter what it took.
Oh, that's good.
Laura's one of my earlier leaders. And so she came and I did basically a training seminar with them, and basically gave them the basics. Good leaders, they don't have to be like the smartest people in the world, but good spiritual leaders usually get that stuff pretty quickly. That's what I found. That, you know, they would ask good questions, but most of the time it was kind of like, it was intuitive because the stuff I was teaching was basically intuitive kind of stuff. But it was basically, you know, how do you lead a healthy small group? And I would go through like these vital signs that I just talked about and so forth. So actually, I didn't even go through these vital signs at that time. Now that I reflect back, because I didn't know all of these vital signs yet, but I just taught, and she ate it up. And then those kind of leaders would start leading. I would get them out there and, just go ahead and start your group. Go ahead and start leading. And the really good ones would ask questions. So I developed, as our group ministry got bigger and bigger, we developed a coaching structure so that there was always somebody who they could go to if it wasn't necessarily me. But Laura was one of those people who would always ask questions and ask really good questions. So that was mostly the extent of it.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, asking good questions is part of this class too. And Joey has asked a great question on our chat. We have a running chat going on as well, Mike. And Joey's asked a question. And instead of me reading the question, I'm just going to, Joey, why don't you turn on your mic and ask it yourself?
Yeah. So, I'm a part of a larger church. And one of the things we measure everything, data, everything. It's part of our weekly metrics things that we put out and put forth. How can I agree with you? I think healthy things grow. So how do you, when it comes to, I guess, measurement, how do we change the idea from, okay, the goal is growth, so let's put strategies in place for growth, multiplication, rather than let's focus on health and that will come? How can you, because I agree with you on that, and I've seen that even in my own areas of ministry, but how do we, I guess, show people that there is a better way than to just try and simply strategize, hey, if we do this, this, and this, it's going to grow, because generally it doesn't.
Yeah, I think there is, you've got to have a healthy balance of both and with this one. And I wish when I was first starting this, when we first started doing the surveying and all that, I wish I would have told our senior minister. I would have known enough to tell our senior minister, who was looking at all of these metrics and so forth. I wish I would have been able to tell him, hey, look, the growth of our small groups may slow down for a season, but then I believe they'll pick back up. I just didn't know that at the time, but that's actually what did happen in the long run. So it took us, we really focused heavily on the health of small groups for a season, for about a year. And we did follow-up workshops, and we did a lot of coaching with leaders and so forth, because we wanted to get that right. But we didn't start seeing the fruit of that until much later. It took a year and a half, 2 years before we started seeing the fruit of all of that. And then we kind of combined the fruit of the healthy groups with some other things that we needed to do, which was a lot of campaigns and stuff like that. So what I was doing is I had 2 tracks that were kind of going the same, starting about the same way. So there was the track of what you would call multiplication. That was just a kind of a line going straight across for a while, because the multiplication wasn't going to happen for a little while. And then I had to add another track in there after like year 2 of addition, where we were just adding lots of groups, doing small group campaigns and all of those kinds of things, and starting 50 groups at a time, knowing that maybe 30 or 40 of those would continue after all was said and done. And by the way, we had a real high success rate compared to a lot of churches with our campaigns, simply because we front loaded all of our campaigns. Rather than just doing a 6-week campaign and then it being over, we would provide lots of training during that campaign for those new leaders. And then we would also provide the next thing they were going to study. And we make it free and easy, whatever it took. And what we wanted to do was to move them towards a real discipleship track, rather than just watching somebody's videos, right? We wanted to move away from videos and towards opening their Bibles and learning how to study the Bible together. So, but that takes a while. You can't start that right off the bat. It's going to take several seasons to get from videos to real Bible study. Did I answer that question?
I think part of the problem that we have in leading these is that we have it's a real control thing. churches want control over the groups, and also leaders want to have some control. I know as my groups have gotten bigger, I've sensed a loss of control, and that becomes a problem, especially if you're dealing with strategy, how you want to control certain key pieces of strategy, how you do formatting, or even, you just mentioned video. In our groups, we tend to use video because it's the most reproducible type of format. It's easy for us to watch a 15, 20-minute video and then have a conversation on it. That's easily reproduced. And what we try to do is we're trying to have a 3 to 4 year curriculum that then just repeats itself. And as these groups grow and as people go through them, maybe they go through the Truth Project twice. That's okay. Or they go through the story twice. That's another one we use. We like these longer series that take almost a year to do, but they're reproducible then. But how about the rest of you? What are you seeing? Got any questions here for Mike? This is your chance. Pick his brain.
Okay, yeah, all right. You're a numbers guy, metrics guy. You're used to leading small groups in kind of a large setting, not just one group, but a lot of groups together. I'm curious about the overall management of small groups. Can you just give us a picture of your reporting? Because I know several others mentioned that's a struggle getting all the reports in. When do you get your reports? What do they look like? And what questions do you ask about small groups? What do you, as the manager of all of the small groups, what do you want to know?
Yeah, I'm going to date myself here a little bit because I've been the last staff position I had where I was leading the small groups ministry takes me back to 2012 now. So I've still been involved. I'm still doing some coaching at the same church where I was leading small groups at that time. Guy named Wes Seabury is leading the small group ministry at Northeast Christian Church now. But so at that time we used, the tool that we used was church teams. And is anybody still using church teams? We found it to be a really valuable tool for our small group ministry. Unfortunately, the rest of the church wanted to use one tool, and we went to something else. I can't even remember what. That wasn't as good for the small groups. But the nice thing about church teams was it was a self-reporting type of a program. So I had to teach my small group leaders how to use that. And basically they went on, or somebody from their group each week went on and gave us the numbers that we wanted. So they reported who was there, what they were doing. For me, when it really gets down to it, let me try to answer your question in a big picture kind of way. I want to make sure that the numbers, if I'm going to spend my time with the numbers and so forth, and they can be important, I want to make sure that I'm asking for the right kinds of things. And I don't have to have everything. I would rather work in a high trust and lower control kind of environment. Now, that's hard when you work with a senior leader who's a high control, low trust kind of a person, right? And that's, part of that is self-management. But so I did want to know numbers in general. I wanted to know how many people were regularly in small groups. I wanted to know for sure how many groups we had that were functioning. And even that, when you get over 100 groups, we got up to about 130 groups about the time that before I left and started doing other things. And it's even hard to know that. I would find out a month later that a small group wasn't meeting anymore. And that's just the reality. But we would work really hard to try to keep up with all of that. I found myself working a lot with our coaches. I didn't want our coaches' function to give me numbers. I wanted our coaches' function, however, to be to encourage our leaders to turn in the numbers that we were looking for. I wish I could be more specific. And if I was leading a small group ministry in a church right now, I probably could be.
Our church uses, it's called Group Vitals. Are you familiar with Group Vitals?
I've heard of Group Vitals,
For
yes.
reporting. And every morning after my group is met, I have to go in and report. Really an easy report as far as who was there. You just basically click on the ones that weren't there, and then you hit enter and it goes in. But it has all sorts of ways that you can then promote your group, because it's all part of a big master database that then intersects and moves out to various web pages. It's well done. Groupvitals.com, I think, is the actual website for it. But which kind of begs another question here. Do you have any, let's just start with small groups out there, or small group ministries out there, that you would say, hey, you guys ought to take a look at what they're doing, because it is healthy. Since we're on health, what are some healthy small group, some churches out there you say they're doing it right from your small group opinion? Got any that you'd recommend?
Well, there are quite a few. I guess the ones that are just coming to my mind right now are ones that I've been associated with. It seems that we're in a time right now of flux, where churches are going in new directions with their small group ministries and trying new things. And I know the church I'm a part of, which is Northeast Christian, I think they're doing a lot of that right now as well. I've worked with a church in south part of Indiana. Why am I forgetting the name of the church now? Green something Christian church.
Is it Greenwood?
Greenwood Christian Church.
Yeah.
I think they're doing some really neat thing, and they're seeing a lot of positive things happening in their church and their small group ministry. Another one of my favorites is because I know the guy who leads it, and I followed what he's doing, is Micah Oder, and he's at I'm sorry, I'm going to forget the name of that church too. Something River.
Is it River?
It's in Cincinnati. It's on the west side of Cincinnati.
Okay.
But Micah Oder is his name.
Well, out here in the Northwest, of course, we've got Jim Putman and his Real Life Ministries, which is completely a small group. In fact, I got to tell you guys, I'm thinking hopefully next week I'll have somebody from that church in here speaking to us, so you can get the Real Life model, because it is totally built on small groups.
They're amazing. I mean, I kind of overlooked even thinking about them, because it's like everybody knows about them, right?
But they're a unique model, and of course out here in the Northwest, Great Northwest, they're very very influential, spreading good healthy groups everywhere.
Yeah.
So
so this is just related to the gal that you mentioned, Laura, that you recruited to be one of your small group leaders.
Yeah.
Just thinking about, Jesus is our model. Spends all night in prayer, and then picks a handful of guys, to be close to him, to walk closely to him. He obviously identified some things in them that others couldn't see, that others were looking past. He didn't look at pedigree, right, or any of these things. And it's kind of the farm league versus the franchise model. I'm looking at Kurt's back wall there, and huge St. Louis Cardinals fan here, even though there's no memorabilia here. It's down in another room. And but just thinking about their model for years was farm league, and they just continued to bring people along through that system. You don't have to be a baseball fan to understand and appreciate the metaphor. It looks like the ministries that I've seen that have been impactful in small group ministry, there has to be something baked into the leadership culture that knows how to understand and identify potential when they see it. So you mentioned Laura's curiosity as one of those things. You said she asked a lot of questions. I find curiosity to be one of the marks. I tell my boys all the time, stay curious. And it's part of, when they go to school every day, it's part of what we talk about. So asking good questions, but maybe beyond that, what are some of the other attributes that you would find in a leader, young or old, that others might look past, but you say, hey, there's something here. And then how do you fuel that so that others have eyes to see potential? Because, and I'll, close with this thought, or respond with this thought, but oftentimes we kind of live in a minister-centric sort of culture when it comes to leadership. So it's I do and you watch. And yet our ecclesiology informs us that more people need to be participating in this thing, like, because the metaphor of the body is relevant here. But
Right. Yeah.
So again, when it comes to identifying those attributes in leaders, what are you looking for, and how are you helping your team to see those things in individuals?
And that's a great question. And it's, you probably heard it's almost a cliche now, you look for, there's always an acronym, a FAT leader, faithful, available, teachable, or a faithful leader. And I've seen that whole acronym spell, but it goes way beyond that. It's before that. I'll tell you a quick story. When I first went, my first ministry was in central Indiana, in Anderson, Indiana. And so this church, Bethany Christian Church, is sitting. Do you know the church, Rick? So you shake your head.
Well, we've got a little bit of a fun thing going on in the chat right now. So
okay, gotcha.
We're listening to you, but there's a few baseball fans that are yammering.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
Causing a ruckus and stating false theology. That's all I'm saying.
Oh, okay, gotcha. All right, so
we're listening to you.
Yeah.
What was the name of the church?
It was a Bethany Christian Church in Anderson, Indiana.
Yeah.
Anderson. So right across from the church, on one corner there was a big high school, and on the other corner was just a big cornfield. And so I got there. It was my very first small group ministry, except for an internship that I had done in Cincinnati. And truthfully, I was out of my element. I didn't know what I mean. They asked me to go there and start a small group ministry because I had written some books on small groups, like I knew what I was doing. And so I'm there, and I've got to start there. And I'm like, how do you start a small group ministry when you don't know what? So all I knew to do was pray. That's all I knew. And I'm standing there at my window, my office, like day one, and I'm looking out the window and I see this cornfield, and it reminded me of Matthew chapter 9, where Jesus says, look at the harvest. And I was literally looking across the street at this cornfield and this harvest. And I'm thinking to myself, Jesus said, ask the Lord of the harvest to send workers into the harvest field. And that's where I started. So I just started faithful praying every day. God, send me workers for your harvest. I know you want to bring a harvest here, and do that through small groups. So I just started faithfully praying and just ask God to show me the people. And I would say, Lord, just as I'm walking through the church foyer this weekend, just show me people that you would point out to me, like stop me in my tracks. And that's how I started looking for leaders from the very beginning of my ministry. I would pray, and then I would observe. I would watch. And if somebody came up to me and started talking to me, I would kind of watch them. I would listen to them. And if I sensed a nudging from the Holy Spirit, I'd talk to them about leading a small group. And I could tell you probably a good dozen different stories of people who actually came to me, and I started talking to them, and I'd ask them to lead a small group, and they'd say, I was just praying about that. I was just praying about maybe leading or stepping into leading a group or something here at this church. I've had that happen so many times. And it was the same thing with Laura. I met her one time, started talking to her. I liked her disposition. I started asking her some questions. I could tell by her answers that she was, a couple of things I always look for is this a praying person? And is this person a worshiper? One of the things I've even done is stood in the back of the auditorium when we're all worshiping. And when I see somebody worshiping, it's like, I bet they'd be a good small group leader. And I try to talk to them at some point in time. I found a lot of small group leaders, most of the small group leaders over the years, just by doing that.
You mentioned acronyms. We've been reading from a man by the name of Gladden. I think it's called Making Small Groups on Purpose, or Purpose Small Group, something like that.
Yeah.
And it's a Saddleback model.
Yeah.
It's a Saddleback model. And if you know anything about Saddleback, they love their acronyms. So
oh, yes, they do.
They have an acronym for everything.
Yeah.
So JP down here is making up acronyms for Pray, Observe, and Watch. It's now POW. So
yeah. I'll have to remember that. I'll work that into my notes when I teach that.
There we go. Take no prisoners, or take all prisoners, I guess would be the way.
That's right.
So, which kind of begs another question for those of us who are looking for resources for small group ministry. Do you have any books that you would recommend that we be reading, other than Myers?
Well, yeah, I'll throw out my own, of course. But Small Group Vital Signs. So I've taught a class like this one in the past, and I had all my students read Small Group Vital Signs because it goes through those vital signs of a healthy small group, and you really can build your ministry around that. The other one that I mentioned before was a book that's called The Pocket Guide to Burnout Free Small Group Leadership. That's probably backwards on your screen there, but what I did with this one is, a lot of times small group leaders, they've got a lot going on in their lives, and then they're asked to lead a small group as well. And it's not atypical for small group leaders to burn out. And I've had lots of small group leaders come to me over the years and say, Mike, I can't lead anymore. I'm going to quit. And especially when they would quit with no plan for the future. And what I found was that the things I've already kind of talked about, putting God first, leading as a Christ-centered group, and then sharing leadership, both keep leaders from burning out because you're sharing leadership. You don't have to do everything yourself. And it also leads to multiplication. So that's what that little book, it's just a tiny little handbook, is all about. It actually goes through the specific things you can do to make that thing happen. Other books that I've written, there's one called Leading from the Heart, a small group leader's guide to a passionate ministry. That was one of the first books I wrote. It's basically, it's based on King David and his leadership model. And then one of the last books I wrote is called World's Greatest Small Group. I self-published this one. So it's available through Amazon. And you can just look up World's Greatest Small Group. I look at Jesus' small group as the world's greatest small group. So those are my own. One of my favorite writers, as far as small groups ministry goes, is a guy named Scott Bourne, Boren. And Scott talks a lot about missional small groups. And his stuff is both deep, like if you want a theologically challenging book, Scott is the guy for you. But he's not so deep that he'll lose you if you're not into all of that. Lots of practical hooks in all of his books that you'll appreciate as well. Scott has written a dozen or more small group books, and he's one of my favorite authors. You mentioned Steve Gladden. I really like Steve. He's excellent writer. What Steve does well is he lays it out on the table for you, and he makes it available for you. Like, here's how you do it. Do these 5 things. The only problem with Steve and some of those other guys who write those kind of books about their own ministries is that sometimes things work for a big church like Saddleback that may not work in your circumstances. And I'm always aware of that, but you can learn some things in those books, and maybe there's some models or something that you can pick up from that. I've got a bookshelf probably with 100 small group books on it. And some of my favorite ones are some of the older ones. So if you're looking for something, a couple books that'll really help, anything by Bill Donahue. Back in the 90s, he was in the thousands, he was at Willow Creek.
Willow Creek, yes.
And he's written some excellent books on small group ministry as well. I could go on and on, but I'll just leave it at that.
Well, we're actually kind of winding down our time here. It's hard to believe that we've gotten, there's a few people have had to already peel off. Chris has come back. He had a patient that was not doing too well, and he's a chaplain and need to deal with that. Welcome back there, Chris. But I don't want us to lose our time without asking this question. Where do you see small groups going in the future? We asked Joe that question. I'd like to hear your thoughts on where small groups go in the future, or small group ministry.
Well, that's a good question. I'm a bit of a historian, especially of the small group movement over the years. And I think that it's kind of circular. I think some of it's coming back. So let me real quick talk a little bit about the history, and I won't go too deep into this. I've written articles on, I think, smallgroupleadership.com, which is my blog site for this. I wrote one about the history of small groups if you want to read that. But there were two guys who were very influential at that sort of the beginning of the small group movement back in the 60s, 70s, 80s. Lyman Coleman, who used to go around doing small group seminars all across the country. Another guy, Ralph Neighbor, who started Touch Outreach Ministries. And he's the cell group guy. You know, he's gone all over the world implementing this cell church model. And both of them actually started at the same place. And that was small groups started out really not as a part of the church. They started outside the church to reach lost people. And that's what small groups were all about back in the 60s and 70s. And they met in like coffee houses and bars and college campuses and all kinds of places like that. And the whole intention was to reach lost people and then disciple them one by one. Just that was as simple as it was. In like the 80s and 90s, the church growth movement started to happen. Did you have a question? Is it okay? So the church growth movement, which you've heard of, kind of came into being. And what they did is they sort of preempted, I guess, is that the right word? They took small groups and used them for their purposes. Because what they found, the church growth movement found, was they had all kinds of great tools in order to grow churches, but they couldn't keep people. They weren't assimilating them very well. So they found that small groups were a perfect tool to assimilate people into the church. So they started using small groups for that purpose. Small groups became then sort of the assimilation tool to get people to stay for the next good 30 years or so. And brings us up to about today or so.
You think that too involved the Sunday school connection? We've talked about that in this class already.
Yeah.
School, at the same time, they're kind of coming across as small groups are coming up. Sunday school is having a slow decline, and even the name itself. I'm a Christian education professor, so we've been talking about the decline of Sunday school for 40 years, maybe 50 years. Yeah.
My degree is also in Christian education, and the first book I wrote was called The Synergy Church, a strategy for integrating small groups in Sunday school. So that's where I kind of started with all of that. And Sunday school has had a variety of different things have happened. The Sunday school classes that still have the same people in them that were in them in the 70s are still going, but those people are all in their 80s and 90s now. Some churches have done a good job of switching, kind of making a turn in their Sunday school classes, and or they're groups that meet on Sunday mornings, and they really function more like small groups that meet in the church building on weekends now. And a variety of other kinds of things have happened with that as well. So I think that's a part of it. But the big part of it is, I think, where we're coming back around, because I think people are starting to think of small groups again, and this is where I see it going in the future, as not as much of an assimilation model as it is, how do we reach lost people through small groups? Because think of it this way. Again, a little history. If you go back to the 70s and 80s, and you know that that model, that what is it called, the big gulf, where God's on one side and people are on the other, and there's this big like Grand Canyon in between them, right? And you build a cross across it, right? Well, back in the 70s and 80s, we could recognize that most people in society were relatively close to the edge of that canyon, so they could see the other side. And all it took was somebody having a conversation with them and inviting them in, and they were good to go. These days, there's a lot more in between them and the edge of that cliff. A lot of junk, a lot of stuff in the way. And the best way for us to reach those lost people that are very, very far away from God, and some of them have never had any kind of a relationship with the church. The only way to really reach them well is to get them into a community. So you start in community, in a small group, build into them, and they might be in a small group for a long time as that group walks with them and helps them to understand the gospel. May never even get to the gospel for a long, long time before they kind of help them cross that bridge. Yeah. So I think that's where we're going in the future. That's what I see.
That's interesting because are you familiar with the Life Tree model, group publishing?
No.
Oh, you haven't? I haven't heard of that.
Life Tree model?
Life Tree. That's a whole curriculum for small groups, but it's made for bars and restaurants and coffee. It's a coffee shop model. And the whole point is to get people in conversations with each other. It is video driven, but they just deal with subjects that everybody talks about and it's constantly just a new study.
Great.
Yeah, it's called Life Tree by Group Publishing out of Loveland, Colorado. It's a wonderful resource.
And that this whole, what I talked about before, this whole discipling model that's going on all over the world, that's a model where you just invite people to gather together with you and you talk about ordinary things. You do get into the Bible, but in a very, not in a real forced way. So it's a lot more organic than a lot of small group models are these days.
Yeah. We talked about in various lectures and stuff, different types of groups or evangelism groups or service groups or those sorts of things. And so just kind of what you mentioned right at the end about, switching from evangelism to assimilation, now possibly going back to evangelism. Yeah. Would you recommend, okay, if there's groups that have people who don't know Jesus, is it something where it's healthy to have an evangelism group, like that it's Alpha or it's Starting Point or it's, any of these sorts of very specific curricula towards that? And then there's, fellowship groups that are separate, right? Or a similar, whatever you want to call those things. Or is it just healthy to kind of balance, but just introduce that to small group people within the church saying, hey, your group may not be everyone who believes the same thing you believe or navigates all that together. Or rather, let's navigate that together by embracing the difference rather than you're in this corner and this is like the new believer small group and you're in this corner and this is the spiritual one small group. How would you recommend navigating that as you look into the future and what that looks like?
That's a really good, insightful question. And so I do agree that it's really valuable in a church to have a variety of different styles, different types of groups that have different purposes, but they all have to have. The problem is when you build silos by doing that, and so the women's ministry leader has her own groups and the men's ministry leader has his own groups, but they're not connected with one another whatsoever. And it's helpful to have to let's say, hey, let's we're all discipleship ministers. We just do it in different places, right? In different ways in the church, but we're all discipleship ministers and we're all after the same thing. So let's get together and figure this thing out. So that's part of it. As far as the evangelistic groups, I don't think it's bad. I know of a lot of churches that do those sort of evangelistic groups. I would rather teach my people to lead those kind of groups and just go out and do it on their own. Less control, a lot more trust, and just teach them how to do it, and allow them to go out and gather their friends around them. Let them come up with how that group's going to be formed. Start praying that the people, that God will help them reach the people who are around them. Start praying for those friendships. They've already got those relationships. It goes back to the starfish model you talked about. Let them lead. Let them take that thing and go, but just equip them to do so, and then keep coaching them after that, and see. What you want to do then is try to help the people in their groups to kind of take whatever next steps those might be.
Great, thank you. And with the, you had mentioned before how, I think it's in the lookout section you were talking about at Christian Standard, how you're kind of having these certain questions that you repeatedly ask. I haven't had a chance to look at those. Are those questions ones that lend themselves towards anyone at any spectrum of the faith to be able to?
They are. So right now I'm going to start writing those myself. We've had a writer write those for a while, and she's done a great job. But in order to kind of get this, I call them discovery questions. So I'm going to start writing those myself to make sure that they are lending themselves to different kinds of people, for one thing, but also that they lend themselves to. I can't just put the exact same questions in every issue, or there'd be no need for it, right? But so they're worded a little bit different every week, but they basically have the same premise. And by the way, every time there's always a question about obedience, for instance. There's always a question about, what do you learn about? Well, there's always a question about, what do you learn about God? What do you learn about people? Or what do you learn about yourself? There's always a question about, like, what do you learn about obedience? Or what do you need to obey in this passage? That's one of those questions that you don't really see a lot in small group curriculum. And then there's always some sort of a question that deals with serving or evangelism. And it ends with a question, well, not completely ends, but one of the last questions has to do with kind of a fill in the blank. This week, based on what we talked about this week, based on this Bible study, I will ... And then there's a follow-up the following week saying, how did that go? So they get to decide, what their I will statement will be. But then the next week you come back and go, so how'd that go? Did you do it? And, if so, how did that go? So it's too early to tell how this is going yet. A lot of our lookout readers were older, but we're trying to reach a younger group through Christian Standard and the Lookout, which are now together in one magazine. We're really trying to reach a younger crowd, because if we keep reaching the same crowd, we won't exist for very long. So we want younger writers, we want younger readers, we want younger users, younger leaders using this thing. So I hope you guys will jump on and at least check it out. It's free online, by the way. So we have a print issue that comes out every month. We have a digital issue that's on our website every month. And then the articles themselves are also self-contained as articles on our website. And that's free. The print issue is not free, but the rest of it's free.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You actually mentioned, Mike, a little bit ago about Lyman Coleman, the serendipity model.
Yeah.
Small groups. He was a heavy influencer of mine. I love the Coleman model. I actually went to one of their workshops. It was a full-day workshop on how to be trained and doing serendipity type of small groups. And for those of you who don't know that, serendipity was, it's the idea of what they do is for the first 6 weeks, it's an open group. Anybody can join the group, but after 6 weeks, you close it down. You use the first 6 weeks of your group, your small group, to get to know each other real well. Then you close it down, and it's a closed group from that point forward. And one of his books that I highly recommend is right here. Yeah. If I was stuck on a desert island and had to lead a small group and only could have one resource, this is it right here, the Serendipity Bible. They have taken every single verse in the Bible and in every passage, and on the side here, actually I'll go to the other page here, there's all these questions for each passage. And there's what they call a coffee cup question, which is just a question to get you into the study. And then they have what they call brain or thinking questions, to study questions. And then they have a heart questions. These are questions for the heart or application questions. And I've used this in so many different ways around over the years. And in fact, I've almost thought about making it a textbook for this class in case you didn't have it, just because I think you should have it so that you can survive like the rest of us do.
Simon and I have become friends over the years. I mean, he actually invited me to go work with him. I didn't, but I started smallgroups.com instead. But he's still kicking. He's still around. And his brother is Robert Coleman. So for those of you who don't know, Robert Coleman is the guy who wrote the Master Plan of Evangelism.
Evangelism, correct.
Yeah. And his brother is Lyman Coleman, who started Serendipity. So
highly recommend it. Highly recommend that book. And again, there are certain books that we have to have in here, and I tend to look at my grad classes as thought classes, where I want you to be thinking about these different books. But Serendipity Bible, man, get your hands on that. And for what it's worth, I like to peruse thrift shops all the time. I find the Serendipity Bible in thrift shops. I buy it and give it to all my small group leaders. It's
not printed anymore. So Lyman wanted to get it reprinted, but he hasn't been able to. Somebody else owns the rights to it and all of that. So Lifeway is the last ones who own the rights to it, but they're not printing it anymore. But you can find it on Amazon. Yeah, used copies of it on Amazon.
Keith just posted a link, I think, to it, right, Keith?
Yeah, so the link that I posted, because of what you're saying, the fact that it's out of print, so I have one of the older copies and used it for years. So when you asked us, Dr. Chromey, to put our resource list together, as I was doing that research to find a link to it, the Life Connection Study Bible came up, and I guess they've taken his content, repurposed it. I haven't actually read this one, but this is the latest version of it, and as I read through the reviews, it seems like they've kind of curated and collated everything for, in this new version, and it looks like it's pretty cheap right now too. So I'm not vouching for it that it is the exact same one, but it's what I'm being pointed to when I do research for it. So
thank you, Keith.
But there is one more resource, Rick, that I wanted to point out, and it's this one here.
Whose is that?
You gotta get this book. I've got it. I've read it. It's excellent. But
that is my new book that's coming out next month, Memorial Day. It's already out in Kindle version, but it comes out in print version. And thanks to guys like Mack Daddy, Mack the Man, it is actually already a bestseller. Did you know that, Mike? It hit bestseller.
Really, that's amazing. It's
Kindle
great.
Yeah. So we're happy about that. JP, you were holding up a Bible or a book of some sort there. What was that you were trying to share with us earlier?
It was just I think it's like I don't know if it's an older version of the same thing.
Yeah.
But, so I was just looking at, I put it on my list as well.
Version is that thing. It's amazing.
Yeah. Keith mentioned about using it for, looking it up for the milestone a couple weeks ago. And so I finally pulled it out. I was like, oh man, why haven't I utilized this more often? So anyways, I was just pulling it out too.
Well, Mike mentioned curriculum writing. I've written a lot of curriculum over the years, but I can tell you the hardest part of getting a group to talk and stay talking is to ask the right questions. And the Serendipity Bible is your lifesaver. It will, so many times we write questions that are just not good questions, and then we wonder why people don't talk. Well, they're just not good questions. Serendipity Bible has, I don't know who, I'm guessing that they have a collection of writers that put them together, but they're all well written. and they
Hey.
get us thinking.
So yeah, there's a long story behind all that. Lyman's story is that he wrote all of the questions, and he wrote them, at least the original ones, and he wrote those during a time in his life where he basically just had to he self-isolated, and because he was just going through a lot of mental struggles and emotional kinds of things. He had a child die, and he just sat down and took every scripture passage and wrote all those questions out. So I've heard another story from somebody else though, but I probably shouldn't talk about that.
Well, Mike, I'll tell you what, it has been a pleasure to have you here with us for this time, and for carving out the time to be with this class especially. I hope you'll do it next year when we offer this class again. But I'm going to give you the last word. We've got just about a minute left. Why don't you give us your last thought to these aspiring small group thought leaders of the future?
Well, I appreciate that, Rick, and thanks for asking me to do this. I do really love hanging out with people who are kind of in a similar mindset of leading ministry, leading small groups, discipling people. And to me, it's our mission, go and make disciples. It's what we're called to do as a church. And we get so busy doing a lot of other things in church that sometimes we get off target. We forget what we're really called to do. And even within small groups, it's important to have community, have fellowship with one another. But fellowship, community is just the place where it's the environment where we make disciples. And it's a great environment. We need to build that environment and make sure that environment is really, really healthy. But let's not forget what we're really called to do. And that's to go out and make disciples, to find people who don't know Christ, introduce them to Christ, and then help them grow to maturity in their relationship with Christ. That's what I'm called to do. And I just want to keep fresh in everybody's minds.
And that's why I do what I do. And hopefully that's why you do what you do, my friends. So you have a great week, and we'll call it a day. And God bless you in your studies as well as your ministries out there. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.